Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar titled Closing the Gap, the Role of Funding in Equitable Education for English Learners in the U.S. I'm Margie McHugh, Director of Migration Policy Institute's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, which we are holding I think I should say celebrate the release of this report that Dr. Julie Sugarman has been working on for a while here at MPI, titled Funding and Equitable Education for English Learners in the United States. And we are really thrilled that we have two other leading experts in the English language learner field, Delia Pompa, who's a senior fellow here at MPI, focusing on education and EL issues, and Shelly Spiegel-Coleman, who's the Executive Director of Californians Together. So you'll be hearing from all of them today as we talk about the report and the larger context that it falls in terms of these issues and their progress here in the U.S. So before we get going, I just want to point out a few logistic issues. First of all, you can see there on the slide that you'll be able to find slides and audio for today's webinar on MPI's website. You also can find the report quite easily on the website. And if you have any problems with accessing the webinar, please either email us at events@migrationpolicy.org or call 202-266-1929. We've got staff who are monitoring both the email account and the phone in order to help out with any problems you might have connecting. We love it when you use the Q&A chat function early on in the webinar, because it helps us just sort of line up a bunch of the questions and be able to group them so that they make a little more sense as a conversation thread after the presentations are through. So please do use that or send an email to us at events@migrationpolicy.org. That's another way just to get questions into the queue. And you also could tweet your question to @migrationpolicy, #MPI discuss. So just as a sort of context setting for this work within MPI's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy, I'll just briefly say that I know a lot of you who have signed up for the webinar are pretty familiar with our work, but basically, we exist to try and improve understanding of integration needs and challenges here in the U.S., and we have a really deep focus on education pipeline issues beginning in the early childhood space, extending through K-12, and also adult education, workforce training, post-secondary. So given that human capital is so important to being able to succeed in the U.S., it's a critical set of systems for us that we place a lot of focus on. And then I'll also say, just since we're in the middle of a presidential election season and the like, we've had a long-standing interest in trying to improve governance of integration at the national level, and so all of our work plugs into trying to help federal government, federal agencies kind of build what we call their brain circuitry for figuring out how to do a better job of helping states and localities and local systems address the impacts of immigration so that immigration is a win-win for immigrants and for the country. In terms of this particular study, some of you who have been following in our work in this area will know that this is part of a series part of a partnership that we have with the Expert Council of German Foundations on Integration and Migration, where we have been looking at school funding issues. Our partners in Germany were looking at the German and French context. We were looking at the U.S. and Canadian context. And an earlier paper in this series titled Improving Education for Migrant Background Students, a Transatlantic Comparison of School Funding, was released a few months ago by us here at MPI. Julie was the lead author on that as well. And our dear colleague, Simon Martz Lang, was a partner in that, and then also an author of a study strictly looking at the German system. MPI, as many of you know, has a global focus on integration issues, particularly looking in the European context, and so our work here in the National Center is a nice bridge with our office over in Brussels for looking at a lot of education issues. So we're just delighted that the U.S. paper is out now for all of you to consider and hopefully use in your work. It was on the one hand a very, I think, a very broad look, trying to sweep in a lot of what we could learn in terms of the U.S. context overall, but then with a particularly deep look at what was happening in California, New York, and Colorado in order to have a basis for comparison of some of the different issues happening at the different levels of governments and systems. So to get us going, Delia is going to provide the legal context and a brief history of how funding issues have developed with regard to EL education in recent years, just to give the overall context of these issues, their importance, their history, before we dive into the report. And I just cannot say how happy we are that Delia has joined us here at MPI a little less than a year ago. Many of you are aware of the storied career that she's had in the EL field. She's both been a leading practitioner at the local level and then has held top policy positions at the local, state, and federal level, and really has devoted her career to trying to improve educational services for English learners. So, Delia, I'll just give it to you to give us the big picture context.
Thank you, Margie. Hello, everyone. As we're heading back to school, I think some of you are probably sitting in classrooms preparing for school to start as you listen to this, and good luck, everyone, with the start of school. We're going to have we have a big year ahead of us with a lot happening. But every time I talk to teachers and other educators and we're talking about equity for students, we talk about English learners, the conversation inevitably goes back to funding and whether there's enough funding for our students. The issue of school funding has been around for many, many years, but in 1973 there was a Supreme Court ruling that to me was a milestone in the history of school funding, especially with regard to English learners. And this case was the Rodriguez versus San Antonio Independent School District case that looked at the Texas system of school funding, which was a property tax system. And what the court ruled in 1973 was that, in fact, the city's finance system didn't violate the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, which is what the plaintiffs were alleging. The Supreme Court also ruled that the state could continue to use property tax to fund schools, which is what Texas did then and continues to do. And most importantly, I think, and the biggest impact on school funding decisions was that education is not a right under the U.S. Constitution, and actually school funding issues were turned back to the state. So since then, we have had a spate of lawsuits, school funding lawsuits at the state level, because this ruling, in fact, said this is not federal business, this is state business. And in that whole set of school finance cases that we have had since then, what we have seen is many, many cases that involved bilingual education solely, or services for English learners solely, or as a part of a bigger school finance lawsuit in the state. So there's been a lot of activity over the years in looking at school funding for English learners. What we do know when we look at school funding, whether we're talking about English learners, other students of color, poor students, is that they disproportionately attend underfunded and under-resourced schools. And when I talk about that, I'm not only talking about the actual funds that go to schools, but the impact of those funds. So these kids attend schools in any study you look at where teachers are less prepared, where there's less technology, there's less equipment, there are smaller and less fancy football stadiums. All across the board, you see a difference in the kind of resources that students of color, immigrant students, English learners, poor students have at the ready for them when they are in school. Another point to consider in looking at the general picture of school funding for English learners and other students with special needs is that often intra-district and inter-district, when it's within a state, resource inequities have a lot more impact than interstate resource differences. Many times when we're looking at school funding, we're looking at what a state provides per pupil. And while that's very important, often within a state, the impact is much greater when you've got within district schools down the road having access to more resources, or within a state, districts right next to each other having more access to resources than their neighboring school districts. So this is an issue that has not been resolved, and it's an issue that we need to look at when we're looking at English learners and their funding, because it doesn't always tell the whole story to look at how much a state provides per pupil. So is there a role for school funding at the federal level? Let's go on to the next slide and talk about that question, because there are mixed opinions and mixed beliefs about whether the federal role there is a federal role in school funding given the Supreme Court ruling I talked about. And in fact, there is a federal role in making sure that states and districts provide sufficient resources to ensure that English learners and other students have access to education. It is not the kind of role some would want where the federal government tells you how much to spend on a pupil, but there is a role that shows up in the kinds of funding the federal government provides to states to supplement what states provide for students. And those of us who are familiar with funding for English learners, as the example Title III provides, know about federal funding and how this funding is supposed to come on top of what a state is already spending. That's the definition of supplemental, and it's the definition that the law lays out as an expectation. The reality of that can be different. If you look across the country, not all states provide specialized funding for English learners. Often in some states, and Julie's going to talk about this later, what you see is funding, access to the funding that all kids get. So there are some questions about how supplemental some federal funding is. I am happy to say that there are new efforts at the federal level to make school funding more equitable. Most recently, in the reauthorization of the ESEA through the Every Student Succeeds Act, we have seen some mention of resource equity. In particular, through the process of negotiated rulemaking, the Department of Education offered language that would require a tightening up of the supplement not supplant rule, which would require states, districts actually, to show that they're spending as much state and local resources in Title I schools as they spend in non-Title I schools. That question of whether that is going to become a rule isn't settled, and it's a big question, and you can read more about this in other places, but it is an example of how there are efforts at the federal level to make school funding more equitable. So another aspect of federal funding that I think is a good context setter, if we can go to the next slide, is the question of adequacy. I talked about whether, or the amounts that states provide per pupil. Those amounts are important, but what becomes more important is whether those amounts cover what is an adequate or good education for students. So one of the first things that states and districts have to define is what the services are that all students need to provide them a meaningful education. And you have to have evidence of what the effective education practices are that dictate what the need is. This is particularly important when one looks at English learners because of the fact that they have special needs. States often and districts must spend more on them. What has been a challenge in school finance cases is to define what those needs are and what makes for a meaningful education. And we continue to look at that question every time there's a new lawsuit that comes up, because as the times change, the definition of adequacy changes. So, for example, when the states began to put into effect higher standards, the cost of getting English learners and other students who were behind grade level often up to those standards increases. So the definition of adequacy increases. Another example is the introduction of technology into schooling and what kind of technology is needed to provide a meaningful education, plus an equitable one with their neighbors down the road. That means the definition, again, of adequacy changes. So there are many, many factors that one has to take into account, and actually adequacy becomes an evolving definition requiring us to look at our school finance structures over time to see if they're changing to keep up with the needs of students. If we could go on to the final slide in my section of it, I would like to urge all of you as educators to become advocates in the way you can, and all of us can do it in different ways, for fair distribution of resources. And that can take many, many forms. We generally think of advocacy as pushing at the governmental level for extra money or different kinds of funding. But there are many, many other kinds of activities you can undertake. If you're a researcher looking at definitions of adequacy, looking at what students need, finding out how much that costs, being able to feed that information into the experts who are looking at school funding is important. If you're a classroom teacher, telling stories about your own classroom, what you have to provide as a teacher because you don't have it in your school, what you see that your kids are lacking when they come in from the different environments they represent. All of those kinds of things, policymakers rely on people who are actually in the field to tell them what the reality is. And so just telling your stories, writing about them, talking to people is very important. If you're a community member, organizing your stakeholders in your community around adequate funding for English learners is very important. And that could range from organizing hearings about the issue, being able to tell your story at school board meetings, going to the state capitol and talking about the needs in your district. All of that is very important. And then finally, all of us, as we look at teacher equity issues and whether students are have access to teachers who are well trained and who have experience and know how to make the professional decisions necessary to provide a good education for all students is a good way to push for extra funding. Good teachers cost more money. Experienced teachers cost more money. And pushing teacher equity issues in terms of distribution of good teachers across the board also helps us push resources across the board where they belong. So just these few things, I think, are things you can do, and I hope that this context will help us listen to Julie and Shelly's presentations in a way that takes us back to what we can do in our own locales. So thank you, Julie.
Great, Delia. Thank you so much. That's sort of great context to put all the information that Julie is about to share. So it's a great pleasure to be introducing Julie Sugarman, the author of the report we're releasing today. Julie is a policy analyst here at MPI's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy, where she focuses on English learner issues, and she brings a tremendous amount of experience to that. You can see there from the brief bio that's on the screen that I knew her before she came here as really what I thought was the leading national expert on two-way immersion programs, and was also delighted to hear so much of the background she had from doing so many evaluations of English learner programs in districts around the country. So we're just delighted to have her now applying all of that background to some of the bigger policy issues that we're trying to make some progress on here at the center. So Julie, pleasure to turn it over to you. And before you make your apologies, I feel like I should apologize for the ridiculous amount of air conditioning we have in the office that I fear has given Julie a summer cold that she's been trying to get over for 4 or 5 days now. So do your best with your tea there as you try and make it through the presentation.
Yeah, sorry for my less than dulcet tones today, but we'll try our best here. So let me forward this So Delia had really brilliantly laid out the critical connection of funding issues to equity and access for ELs. One thing that some of you might be interested in school finance, because you might have heard politicians argue that the level of funding isn't relevant to educational quality, and what's more important is what districts and schools do with the money they have. But if you dig into the research, you'll find quite compelling evidence that school funding levels do matter. And there's an excellent summary of that research in a newly updated report by Bruce Baker. He sums up his findings by saying, schooling resources that cost money, including smaller class sizes, additional supports, early childhood programs, and more competitive teacher compensation, permitting schools and districts to recruit and retain a higher quality teacher workforce, are positively associated with student outcomes. This is an important moment to be interested in school finance because there's a number of new opportunities, as Delia mentioned, for stakeholder input. First, as a result of the new federal education law, ESSA, states will be revising their educational regulations in a number of areas and looking for stakeholder input to do so. And of course, everything you do in regulations eventually affects funding. Second, there's been a trend over the last couple decades for states to be giving districts more discretion over budgeting while holding them accountable for outcomes. And then also there's been a trend in some places to give principals more discretion around their budgets rather than having all spending allocated at the district level. So as these important policy decisions get pushed down from higher to lower levels of governance, there are more opportunities for stakeholders to provide input into budget processes. So for people who will be interested in getting involved in budget conversations, there are 3 areas that I think are important to understand in order to be able to provide useful input and to understand the ramifications of budget decisions. 1, what is the overall funding context in terms of adequacy and equity? 2, what are the different sources of funds that are available for ELs and how do they work? And 3, what is the nature of the EL population and the services provided? So this is what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. First, it's important to look at the overall level of funding in the state and a district in order to think about whether EL programs are given adequate resources. This is important because EL programs and their funding are not isolated from all other instruction. Also, ELs are often enrolled in districts that are both high need and have a lower local tax base. So one question you would want to ask to understand your local situation is how much the state is doing to even out the differences between wealthy and less wealthy communities in funding their schools. This graph shows the distribution of K-12 funding in 2014 among the federal government, states, and localities for each of the 50 states. Along the bottom, the dark blue portion of the column is fairly consistent with the share of federal funding between 5 and 15%. Looking at the share of state funding, which is represented in light blue, from left to right, you'll see the share of state funding gradually increasing from around 30% to a high of almost 90%. So the states on the left side of the graph have a greater share of their education funding coming from local sources, which naturally vary widely in terms of how much money they have to fund their schools. On the next slide, I'm going to show you a comparison of ways that states can be more or less helpful in terms of making up for those local differences. But before we see that, I just want to point out that the 2 states that we're going to compare, Illinois and Connecticut, have about the same percentage of funding coming from the state level, about 40%. So this figure comes from an excellent analysis by the Education Trust, and you can see the reference for that at the bottom of the screen. If you look just at the yellow portions of the columns, you'll see that the difference in local spending is what you would expect to see. The highest poverty districts in both states are able to come up with far fewer dollars than the lowest poverty districts. But if you look at the state spending shown in aqua, in Connecticut, they provide a lot to the poorest districts and very little to the wealthiest districts, so that they're not only equalized, but the poorest districts, which we know often enroll the neediest kids, have more total funding, adding together the local and the state. And on the other hand, Illinois provides closer to the same amount for wealthier and poorer districts, so wealthier districts end up with more total money. This study showed that there were 16 regressive states like Illinois, where the highest poverty districts got less money than the lowest poverty districts. And by the way, if you're in New Jersey, this is exactly the issue that's brewing with Chris Christie's proposal from a couple weeks ago. So if you're interested, there's been quite a lot written on this online. So now we'll turn to the question of what are the different sources of funds that are available for ELs and how do they work? Our new report goes into a tremendous amount of detail on this issue, so that would be a good place to start, but I'll just go through it quickly here. First, you have federal grants, including Title III, which provides funding based on the number of ELs and recent immigrants in a state, as well as the Migrant Education Program and the Refugee School Impact Grant, which are small grants given to just certain districts. Federal grants, as Delia mentioned, are intended to supplement the core services that schools and districts provide. Almost all of the states provide some additional money to districts on the basis of the number of ELs that they enroll. Many of them do that with a weighted formula built into the state funding system. For example, ELs get an additional 50% of whatever the foundational per pupil allotment is. And some states have a categorical fund based on yearly appropriations. These funds, both weighted formulas and categorical funds, vary from state to state in terms of how much control the states have over how they're spent, meaning whether the money just goes into districts' general funds and they don't have to account specially for it, or if they do have to provide a budget or have funds monitored. States also have ways of controlling costs and acknowledging different levels of needs among ELs. A number of states have a cap on the number of years that a student can be eligible for funding, usually 5 or 6, although the states do acknowledge that districts have to continue to serve kids who are identified as EL, whether they get the state funding or not. Some states also adjust the amount of funding that districts get based on whether districts have a particularly high or low concentration of ELs, or on grade level or a student proficiency level. But there are very few states who do that. Most just allocate the same amount for all ELs. I also want to point out that most districts allocate money to EL education from their general budget, which is made up of discretionary funds from state and local sources. That's why budgeting for ELs is really complicated, because you can't just look at the sum of the Title III federal grant and the state supplementary funding to know how much money a district is spending on ELs. The third area of interest to stakeholders that I mentioned at the beginning was what is the nature of the EL population and the services provided? We'll talk first about school-level variables, and a big one here is the instructional model used, where the cost varies based on the number of teachers needed. For example, in elementary school, a self-contained ESL class with one teacher who provides instruction all day to 20 students would be cheaper than a model where those 20 students are pulled out of their grade-level classrooms to work with an ESL teacher in small groups. However, it's really important that as we talk about these different instructional models, that pedagogical priorities not be vetoed based on cost. As we all know, some things that lower the cost might also lower quality. So there are also lots of other expenses that go along with serving ELs, like support services, translation and interpretation, and materials and assessments. And here's where it's important to understand the overall structure of how a district or school budgets its money, because sometimes these services are paid for by EL departments and sometimes they're not. And some things in these categories can be covered by Title III and others can't. And that's not even consistent from district to district. It takes a really savvy administrator to know how to weave together all of the different sources of money with their different rules and to be able to leverage the different funds available to them to meet student needs. Another important consideration is the demographics of the population. with older newcomers with lower prior education generally needing the most intense services. This might create variation between districts. For example, if immigrants tend to come to a region and settle in one area and then move somewhere else once they're more established, you might see one district with a higher level of newcomers and students with very low English proficiency, and a nearby district where a greater share of the students are at higher English proficiency. Historically, there's been a wide variation in the eligibility and exit criteria for being an English learner across states and even within states. This is an important thing to keep an eye on in the next couple of years as states work towards creating more consistency in these criteria under the new federal law. This relates to finances because how EL students are defined based on test scores and other criteria will impact how many of them there are, which then affects how far a given dollar amount goes. Another thing to consider is the variation in salary for teachers with specialized skills and credentials. Some districts might need to offer a higher premium where there's a shortage of specialized teachers. And related to that, you might find variation in the cost of teacher training based on the number of highly skilled teachers available. One district administrator that I talked to mentioned that they were experiencing really high teacher turnover, which greatly increased the amount that they were spending on paying for teachers to take coursework, leading to an ESL credential. So the report that we released today, and which you can access on MPI's website, shows a lot of innovation and work on the issue of EL funding, but also a lot of work yet to be done to be sure that funds are allocated based on context and needs. In most cases, it seems that funding decisions are made by trying to figure out how to divvy up a too small amount of resources across a large number of needs. Even where states have conducted cost studies to try to understand what the actual costs are to meet the educational standards they've set, sometimes even that doesn't guarantee that an adequate amount of money will be available. You really see how complex an effort this is at the district and school level, where administrators are trying to deal with issues like providing equal services in schools that serve high number of ELs versus those with just a handful, or trying to guess how many newcomers they might receive 6 or 12 months from the time they have to draw up their staffing plans for the following year. I think one of the clear conclusions from this study is how important it is that we get more empirical information about the actual cost of services, so that as we're looking closely at student outcomes, we can have some data about what it will really cost to get those outcomes to the level that we'd like to see.
Great. All right. Thanks, Julie. And thanks to all of you who have already been sending in some of your questions. Please keep sending them along to either via the Q&A function or to events@migrationpolicy.org. So I think one of the great values of the study is the way that it helps provide, in a sense, the kind of the intellectual framework for trying to unpack what might be going on in a particular state. In terms of the thought process and the pressures that policymakers are under and school districts are under as they try to basically create a lot of these policies, you know, as they're what's the expression, building the plane while you're trying to fly it. But anyway, so someone who's really living through that is Shelly Spiegel-Coleman, who is out in California, and she's one of those savvy administrators that Julie was referring to with a ton of experience working on these issues at an incredible number of positions where issues related to improving the quality of education for ELs was really the central concern of her job. And then to everyone's benefit, when she left those positions, she became the executive director of Californians Together. For those of you who don't know Californians Together, it has been involved in a wide range of initiatives that are trying to improve policy and practice for ELs in California, and really making a huge difference at that with their research and capacity building efforts for folks all over the state. So who better to ask to join us in this conversation, given everything that's happening in California with the local control funding formula and both the challenges and opportunities of trying to leverage that major new kind of, I think maybe we can still call it innovation in how the state's dealing with these school funding issues, then Shelly. So Julie addressed these issues a fair amount, or looked at local control funding a good bit in our report, but we really wanted to have Shelly join us and are delighted that she could, since she's so much on the front lines with working on that and other issues related to improving our instruction in California. So, Shelly, passing the baton to you, and thanks again for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm just so pleased to be a part of this work and to understand that what we're doing in California is really in the context of what the nation is looking at across the state. So as Margie and Julie have referred to, California in 2013 passed a new school finance system, which we are calling the local control funding formula. And when the governor, when our governor, Governor Jerry Brown, who was very involved in setting up this new school finance system, when he did, he was very clear that this was to have an equity intent. And so his famous quote that we like to share with everybody is that equal treatment for children in unequal situations is not justice. And so the way the local control funding formula was written, it did recognize that certain students had additional academic and language needs, and so that financial resources needed to be appropriated so that these students with additional needs had support behind them. The law specifically calls out three groups of students: low-income students, English learners, and foster youth. And you'll see that those three groups of students are throughout my short presentation here. The intent of the local control funding formula was really to be a step forward so there would be more equitable funding. Prior to that, there was really a great variance in terms of high wealth districts and low wealth districts. Actually, there still is now, but not to the extent that there was before. And this is an attempt to try and really equalize the amount of funding behind students no matter what their zip code is. And the top priority, one of the top priorities for sure in the legislation was to make sure that there was improved and increased student services for what's being called unduplicated students. Those are those three groups of students, and we're saying unduplicated because, for instance, an English learner only counts once as an English learner. They may be low income and they may be foster youth, but they only get counted once. So we have this wonderful new term in California called unduplicated students, but it refers to the three targeted group of subgroups of students. And so this is how the formula works. There's a base amount of money that's behind each student for state funding. It is differentiated by grade levels: elementary, middle, high school. It is actually K-3 and upper elementary, middle, and high school. But then here's where the equity formula comes in. For each English learner, low-income student, or foster youth, the amount of funding that goes to the district is added by 20%. Each of these students counts once, and they generate another 20% of the base funding for the school funding. And so districts will get the base, and then they'll get the supplemental grant. And then there's a recognition of the districts that are highly impacted. And so districts who have 55% of their students being students from these unduplicated students, so 55% of their total student population being English learner, low income, or foster youth, they would get, on top of the supplemental and the base grant, what's called a concentration grant. And that is 50% above the base grant. And so you put that all together, and that's the funding that school districts get to run their schools on. So as you saw, there was supplemental concentration grant funds, and those funds are generated by the students, by the student count, and English learners are clearly a large group in that student count. And the law says, as I said before, and you'll see that this is going to run through my comments, the law, it was very clear that there need to be increased or improved services for these students. And it talked about in proportion to the base number. So there's a formula now that is computed as to, of the total supplemental concentration grant funds, there is a percentage that is supposed to be spent on improved and increased services for these students. But the legislation, nor the policy, nor the regs mandated that the funds generated by these students had to be spent on the students. So one could say that a new reform increases or improves improves services for these students in a more significant way than it does for other students. But it still is that other students are benefiting from the program or the service that might be implemented. It also might be that after you spend the proportion that you need to spend on these students, that the large bulk, and that's what we're seeing, the large bulk of the supplemental and concentration grant funds are being spent on something entirely different. For instance, teacher salary raises, building repairs, buyback days. We had shortened calendars during the recession, so they're buying back days into the school calendar. So for us, us as Californians together, we were very disappointed in the legislation that it was not clear that the students who generate the money, that money should be spent on those students. And so as we say, a first lesson when looking at weighted student formulas or a new school finance system is to make sure that the money generated by these students is really clear, that those dollars be spent on services for the designated students. As an accountability measure, because the schools get the money now, and as an accountability measure, each district is required to submit annually what's called a local control accountability plan. And in that plan, they are to describe their actions, their services, and their expenditures to improve achievement for all students. There are 8 state priorities that California has laid out that the districts need to address in their accountability plans. And the plans have a similar feature because they all need to use a template for writing this plan that was adopted by the state board. They submit a 3-year plan, and then they submit annual updates. So the districts had very little direction as to how they were to address their student subgroups in the plan. It just said that they needed to, but it was very, very general and very flexible. And so the second lesson for us and for anybody else who's listening or whose state may be thinking about doing this is that for implementation, whatever form implementation takes in a state for implementing a new school finance system and for any kind of reports that states will have to make for use of these funds, we think it is absolutely necessary that these reports, these templates, these directions for implementation need to be specific and targeted, and of course we're talking about for English learners, but of course any other student subgroups. And to leave how they will address the needs of the students who are most in need, to leave that up to each individual district to decide really puts us in a position at a state level of really not knowing what is the impact of this whole new school finance system. And because of that, when those reports started coming in, so we now have had 2 years of accountability plans that have been submitted. The plans get submitted to what we have, the intermediary agencies called county offices. They review the plans. The review has not been that stringent, and so by and large what districts submit get approved. There are some revisions that are asked of by the county office, but in terms of the specificity and the high quality targeted comprehensive programs for English learners, that has had a very cursory review by the county offices. So when we saw these plans coming in and we saw how superficial in terms of English learners the reports were, we decided that we needed, as Californians together, to do a study on a sampling of these district plans. And we went about choosing 29 school districts in California to review. We chose the 15 districts in California that had the largest student population. We chose 8 school districts who had 50% or more of their student population being English learners, so we wanted high impact districts. Many of these were smaller districts in our Central Valley that were more migrant students, but we wanted high impact districts. And then we had a few districts in the sample who we knew had a history of comprehensive programs for English learners. And what we wanted to look at when we reviewed these plans were specific goals and outcomes with specific metrics for English learners. We wanted to see if we could see increased and improved services, what actions and steps they took for improving and increasing services, and what were the funds that they used for the improved and increased services. Of course, we wanted to look at whether they were able to identify research-based practices for improving academic achievement as well as language proficiency. And within the local control funding formula, there was a specific emphasis on parent input. And there was a specific role for our District English Learners Advisory Committee to give input. We wanted to look at what was the role, what was the input provided by our parents, and what were the parents' involvement in the implementation phase after the plans were submitted. And so what we needed to do to read these plans, we needed to come up with a systematic way where we were all reading them through the same lens. And so we took a look at this research from Dr. Patricia Gandara and Maria Sarete from the UCLA Civil Rights Project, and they looked at what does the research tell us about high-quality programs, and what does it tell us about practices that have efficacy for English learners? And they grouped that research according to the 8 state priorities that were in our local control funding formula. So we used their research, and we developed rubrics to read the plans. And we had 10 focus areas, and you can see the rubrics have a 4-level rating. You can see the 10 focus areas that we used to read the plans. And most of those, in the 10 focus areas, the 8 state priorities are there, but we added English language development because we thought that was so important. And one other area, and professional development, we pulled that out. We thought those 2 were key for us. And then these rating areas, you can see exemplary in the rubrics. In the exemplary column is where we put what the research told us was exemplary practices. So we put that in exemplary, and then we moved back to good and weak. Our last column was no evidence included because we had to assume that for many districts they may be doing something, but there was no evidence of it at all in the plans. So we read these 29 plans, and then we rated. The rubrics look something like this. And then we rated the districts, and then we had key findings. For us, it was very disappointing. We were, this is the sense we had from talking to school district people, the sense we had from talking to parents, that there was the intent, this equity intent of the local control funding formula was just not playing out in the school districts. And so the key findings, this is actually the key findings from our Year 2 report, because we produced a Year 1 report reading those 29 plans, and then we said, okay, that was Year 1. Maybe they were just getting started. We'll read Year 2. So we read the plans for the same 29 districts, hoping to find an increased awareness of what districts needed to commit to for higher quality services to English learners, but again, we're very disappointed. So here are some of our key findings. It was very difficult for us to see the actual dollars behind English learner services and programs. That what was in the plans was really was not adequate, and that we could not tell whether there were improved or increased services for English learners. Districts did not write to that priority that the law stated. The actual template did not really require them to write about how they were improving and increasing services for English learners, and it was not apparent when we read the plans. And then very few districts gave explicit, specific designed or said they were going to implement any specific services or programs that were aligned to EL needs that they may have stated or needs that they may not have stated, right? And then this was a very big area for us of disappointment, and you can imagine for those of you across the nation that all districts had been required to develop new English language development or English language proficiency standards aligned to the Common Core or aligned to your language arts standards. California adopted their new standards in 2012, and the law did call out that districts had to include the work that they were going to do to implement the Common Core as well as the English language development standards. In the plans, we saw a lot of reference to the Common Core and very little reference to the English language development standards. Largely, English learner outcome measures were missing, and for parents, for the English learner parents, what we saw was, yes, there was a meeting. Nowhere did they list the recommendations that the parents suggested, and if a district listed a few recommendations that the parents suggested, nowhere was it obvious that those suggestions made their way into the plan. So the issue of English learner parent input for us was very weak and inconsistent. For us, we felt that what we needed to be about as Californians together was really to ask that the template be revised and that there be very specific guidance on how the needs of English learners were to be met. The template is being revised, and we have been in stakeholder meetings trying to put some more specificity into the directions as well as the template itself. We have seen 1 or 2 versions, and we're hoping actually in 2 weeks to see another version. There is some more attention to the issue, but right now for us it's not enough. The other piece is that there's a real need for the districts to have technical assistance and support and providing English learner expertise on what are the best practices, because prior to this, there was a lot more direction, and there was a lot, we had categorical programs, and there was a lot more directions about how to spend the funds and what was appropriate in terms of the expenditures. And without any of that direction now, districts are really almost at a loss as to, well, what would be the best practices to put in it? We took on the responsibility of doing some professional development across the state last year to try and work with district leadership teams who were working on writing the plans to talk to them about, okay, what are the needs of your English learners? What do we know research says about what would be the best way to address those needs? And of all of this, what do you think you would want to focus on to put in your plans? Districts desperately need that kind of support when the kind of local control is handed individually down to districts. And then, of course, our big job is to hold the state accountable for monitoring and to set targets so that we can ensure the access and the equitable opportunities are there for English learners. California is in the process now of developing the local control funding formula rubrics that will be used to look at how well the districts are doing with their funding. And again, we're involved in many, many conversations with stakeholders as well as our State Board of Education to make sure that the targets and that the indicators in this new accountability system will be sensitive as well as appropriate for English learners. And so just kind of to close it, these are our kind of final lessons that that we feel we've learned from. And one is it's really important with this work to be in a significant coalition of allies when you're advocating for monitoring implementation of any new school finance system. So in the state we're a coalition. Californians Together is a coalition of 24 organizations, but we are a part of a larger coalition called the LCFF Equity Coalition, and that effort of coalescing with allies who are looking at the issue of equity is really important when an effort like this has begun in your state. The other thing is really to develop relationships with your state education agency and any other policy bodies. So we have a very good relationship with our state superintendent of public instruction and many of the leadership in his agency, and we are able to have ongoing conversations with people who have responsibility for developing the implementation plans. We think it's important certainly to nurture and develop these kinds of relationships. It has been advantageous for us. I can't say that we've been able to turn everything around, but we have been able to have input and we have been able to push the agenda. And then the last piece is that when you have a new funding formula and a new accountability system being developed all at the same time, there are a million places you have to be at once. There are meetings here, there are conference calls there are coalitions meetings here, and to be able to have enough people to be at every avenue and every venue to be a part of the conversation and raise the issue on English learners is really critical. So thank you very much.
Great, Shelly. Thank you so much. That was a great kind of tour of all of the issues and problems that I actually think are pretty common for folks who have worked these issues at the state level. You know, it's really an area where there's no silver bullets. I think, you know, lots of folks have fought to get some of this extra money for ELS, and then, you know, that's not even half the battle. It's, you know, maybe more like a tenth of the battle because of the issues that you then have in terms of the ability of districts to implement, whether there's, you know, accountability and the like. And Julie, I was thinking that this would be an interesting thing for you to comment on, because it really is one of the tensions that you talk a lot in the report about, that on the one hand you really want to give flexibility to districts because they can be so different in what their needs, their strengths, their capacities are, and at the same time it is just incredibly frustrating, you know, to really not have some stricter accountability in terms of how the money is spent because of all the a lot of the issues that Shelly was pointing at. So maybe do you want to say a little bit about how you saw that balanced in New York and maybe even Colorado, since they were somewhat different kind of solutions to trying to get some accountability, even if it wasn't explicitly part of the funding mechanism?
Yeah, absolutely, and of course we've seen in a number of states moving from having sort of categorical funds where you have to have a budget and keep track of the funds and tell them exactly what you're spending it on, to just sort of saying, here is a pot of money based on your EL students, and New York went through that about 10 years ago, and so at this point New York doesn't require any, the districts to say that we're spending this particular dollar on these particular kids, but sort of outside of that issue, they are asking districts to say, we have this many kids and this many teachers, and so because New York has a really specific requirement for how much time kids need to spend with a certified teacher, they can go in and look and say, oh, you have enough teachers, or oh, you really don't have enough teachers. So it's not really about the money per se, it's about the services that are provided. Colorado also has a categorical fund, but they don't really require a budget. Again, it's really more about making sure that the services are there. So in the report, there's a lot of examples of how there's different approaches to providing accountability. Some states still do follow the money very closely, but more and more states are not doing it by following the dollars, but looking at the service and outcomes.
So it looks like from a number of the questions that we're getting that people do have particular questions about how things work in their state, and I think I think, Julie, you wouldn't mind talking to some folks who maybe have questions about how to follow dollars in their states, or how to think about, you know, there's both the sleuthing question about really understanding what's going on, and then also thinking about these adequacy questions. So anyway, I would say that we'll be happy to follow up with some folks who are writing in about that. But Delia, I was thinking maybe you could take this, you know, there's a lot of interest from folks MPI works with, and we've gotten some questions about this here, about how to just even be able to follow what's happening with translation and interpretation services, because lots of times community advocates might, you know, it's hard to kind of be on the inside baseball part of, you know, a lot of the instructional money, but then what community stakeholders see very often is just a lack of even simple translation and interpretation services. So could you say a little bit about just how to follow that set of issues? And I was thinking also, given what you were saying about the federal level, you know, there's also some role for the federal government going in if there really do appear to be some civil rights violations in terms of just, you know, really unresponsive services for ELS.
Sure. I think the first thing I'd like to say is we need to harken back to Shelly's presentation. Following the money is difficult for anybody, even for someone who does it as part of their professional life in studying school finance. So it would be difficult to say, to isolate how the money is being spent on translation and interpretation services. Sometimes the districts just don't break that out. I would say that there are a couple of things that you can do. One is to look at the federal requirements for language access and to determine if, in fact, there is adequate attention being paid in your district to those requirements. In terms of informing parents, we're talking about English learners, in terms of informing parents about assessment outcomes, about instructional decisions, those kinds of things. The second thing is I think you have to go in and ask specific questions about translation and interpretation. I don't know any other way to do it because the money isn't, the expenditures usually aren't reported out by a district in terms of a breakdown. Sometimes when Title III funding comes in or Title I funding comes in, the school itself doesn't track the expenditures. So as a parent or a community organizer going to your local school, it would be difficult to determine what is actually being spent. You'd have to go up to the district level, and then it's going to take some sleuthing. Somebody used that word earlier. It is exactly what it takes. So I'm afraid I don't have an answer for you that is will make you feel good about it. It is a matter of being very specific in your questions and understanding what there is a right to. Often in federal law, there are suggestions about how the money can be spent or may be spent, but not actual requirements for spending portions of the money for a particular kind of service. So I wish I had a better answer for you.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. And then I'm just going to sort of squeeze another question in here for Shelly and maybe Julie. So Shelly, there was a question about your slide where you talked about the grade level, the base that's given for the different grade levels, and then that the EL supplement is on top of that. Could you say whether there's what the difference is in terms of the base rates? Because one of the issues that we were looking at in the report, and that's come up here and in the earlier report, is whether anybody's really tailoring their L supplemental funds in a way that tries to get at which L's might be more difficult to serve. For example, kids who are late arriving in high schools, for example, you know, is there that level of sophistication in any of the funding formulas out there for people, you know, who really want to, you know, consider if they're going to be pushing for some of these supplements? Is it just a, you know, like a one size for everyone, or is there more differentiation? So could you just talk about at least what the underlying differentiation is in California?
So yes, so there's a base level for K-3 of about $6,800 about. Then there's a base level for grades 4 through 6, $6,900. A base level for grades 7 and 8, $7,100, and 9 through 12, $8,200. So give or take some dollars, right? So there is no differentiation by the different cohorts of English learners. Each English learner for the supplemental gets you 20% above the base, and if you're in a district with a high concentration, then you get 50% above the base. You get the 20 and the 50. You get the supplemental and the concentration.
Great, great. And then, Julie, I know this has come up in the context of a lot of the unaccompanied minors, for example, or late arriving immigrant and refugee kids. Do you see any kind of action on that in the look around the country?
Not at the state level. At the state level, only a couple of states provide differentiated funding based on the language proficiency level, with more for lower levels, or based on grade. That's in the report if folks want to look at that. It's really just a couple of states. But that sort of thing is definitely a concern at the district level when districts are looking at how they're going to divvy up their money that comes from the state and their own local funds. That's definitely a huge concern for them.
Right. And it's also one of the recommendations in the report that, you know, we should maybe be looking at this in terms of the federal money that's provided, especially when you think about how many of the late arriving kids are coming explicitly as a result of federal immigration policies that, you know, the federal government could maybe be helping districts a little bit more since these are federally involved kids. But in any event, I think we need to leave it there. Thanks to everybody who's been holding on a little bit past the hour. If we didn't get to your questions, we will follow up with you with answers via email. And I just want to thank Delia, Julie, and Shelly for this terrific webinar and all this great information, and encourage all of you to go to our website for the report, and feel free to contact us by email if you have additional questions about it. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.